Welcome. How can organizations model jobs in ways that can help them meet strategic business objectives, as well as guide any subsequent curriculum development or intervention creation? Is there a work formula for improving organizational performance? How can executives, managers, and workers use the language of work to identify needs, specify appropriate solutions, and collaborate with HPTers to implement and continually improve organizational performance? During their time with us today, Danny and Kathleen Langdon will discuss the language of work, how they've applied it and the results they've obtained, and when to use the language of work along with other performance improvement models. They will also answer your questions. They're looking forward to talking with our students, graduates, and faculty. Danny and Kathleen, we're delighted to have you with us today.
Well, thank you, Steve. I'm pleased to say that I have a long history with BSU, not only in the sense of a daughter that went there, but also that in the early days of the formation of this very program of yours, I taught one of the courses back then. And so it's a pleasure, absolute pleasure for Kathleen and I to come to you and talk about the language of work after these many, many years of having gone to the field and tested this model out and found out just how effective it is. So what I'm going to do is give you about a 20-25 minute introduction to the language of work, and then we're going to turn it over to some questions. And so the language and work model is a systemic enterprise-wide behavioral model based on the work formula that integrates organizing, managing, implementing, and continuously improving work. It's important to understand that in doing so, it helps achieve work alignment, transparency, and continuous improvement throughout the entire organization. In essence, what this is really a reflection of what an organization is. And it's a reflection that looks at it systemically, that is, what's going on. So it's not an end goal kind of definition of work in the sense of goals and objectives and things of that sort, even though those things can be defined as a result of using this model. But it's a dynamic model that really reflects what work is. And in the long run, when it's computerized, it'll become a form of monitoring what's going on in an organization and allow one to run simulations against it. But that's the future. What I want to talk about here is the presence. So I'm going to introduce you to the language of work just as we introduce anybody to it whenever we go out and engage a client in the real world. And one of the fundamental questions is there really a formula for work? If there is a formula, what can it do for us? How powerful can it be? All of this stems, by the way, personally from the fact that I prepared myself actually as a chemistry teacher. I went out and taught chemistry for a few years. So I'm very oriented to science, and I'm very oriented to formulas. And that's why back in 1992, I developed the work formula and then began to see how it could be used to look at business and organize it, manage it, implement it, change it, things of that sort. The formula that I've devised has 6 elements to it. You see them on the screen here. And what I'd like to do is to switch over from what you see here for a minute to actually give you a presentation on that formula just as we do it. What this is years ago, I used to take 3-4 hours to explain what the language of work. Kathleen one day said, you got to boil this down to 10 minutes. So with that challenge, I developed this 10-minute teach, as we call it. And we have literally implemented this thing thousands of times with various people throughout the world. And it's a nice, convenient, easy way to explain what the work formula is. And we do it in the context of American football. And believe me, it actually works universally throughout the world. What I'm going to do is introduce you to the work formula. You see these 6 words on the screen here, and they're 6 words right out of the English language. So I'm sure you have a meaning to each word yourself. But what I want to do is establish a common meaning for these 6 words among us. As we look at these 6 words, they're actually divided out into 2 major parts. There's the first called inputs, processes, and outputs. That's the old classic manufacturing model that Henry Ford had in mind when he improved work back in the beginning of the century, where he was simply saying, okay, I've got certain resources, I'm going to set up an assembly line, and we're going to produce cars as an output. And that was a pretty simple model that he could work from. Work is a little more complicated in this day and age, and what I've done is added 3 other words to it. Those are conditions, consequences, and feedback. Now, the easiest way to explain what these words are is to put them in some kind of context. So the way we do it is we take American football and we simply point out that football is simply an example of any kind of work in any kind of business. That is, work is made up of 4 levels of work. There is the enterprise itself, the whole business. There are its core processes, there are its jobs, and there are its work groups. So what I'm going to do is introduce these 6 words through a definition of the core process, that is the playing of football, of American football. And I can define each word as we do so. When we go about doing any kind of work definition to achieve clarity and understanding of what it is, we always begin with the outputs. And the outputs are the deliverables. They are the products and services that one is producing for whatever reason. In American football, one of those outputs is a touchdown. It's what we deliver. It's what we give the fans, as it were. And there are other outputs which we would need to identify if we were to define this work completely. For example, we could say a field goal, an extra point, a safety, things of that sort are outputs, and we'd all end up agreeing what are the 5 or 6 outputs that actually constitute football. The second element of work we would then want to define are the inputs. And inputs come in 2 forms. There are the resources that are needed, such as players, the ball, etc. And then there's that kind of input that triggers or begins the work. And that takes different forms. The clock, the kicking the ball, the calling of a play, for example, would be typical trigger inputs. The third element we want to define are conditions. These are the rules and regulations, the governances, as it were, and they come in 2 forms as well. There are external conditions. These are set in football from the National Football League in organizations. Those conditions often come from government regulations and laws and so on, such as OSHA, that influence the work. But there's also internal conditions. In football, it is the playbook. In business, it is typically things like the employee manual and other kinds of documentation that set down how the work is to be done, when and where and how much. The fourth element of work is the consequences. The consequences are the positive things that we want to produce. They are the value add. In football, it's the winning of the game, the tying of the game. It could be the losing of the game. And those consequences are produced by certain kinds of outputs. Otherwise, it takes a touchdown to get a positive consequence. The fifth element of work is the process steps. And those are the procedures that are used in order, using the inputs under the conditions in order to achieve each output. Sometimes those process steps are fairly complex because in producing touchdowns, there are different ways to do so. Sometimes those process steps are quite simple, which in the case of kicking a field goal is a pretty simple process, unless you miss. There's feedback, finally, as the sixth element of work, and it comes in 2 forms too. There's a kind of feedback that we use as we are doing the work in order to do the work better, to make corrections, to know that we're doing it right. But the other kind of feedback, which is particularly critical, is to know that we've actually achieved the output and the consequences. And that, in the case of football, is when the umpire raises his hand in the air, no matter what anybody else says or does, till that happens. That's the only way we get the positive feedback that that has been achieved. So what have I done here? I've taken these 6 words to describe something that's fairly complex. And in business, we can do the same thing. We can not only define core process, but we can define jobs the same way. Thus, if we take the job of a quarterback or any other job in an organization, we can define its outputs, its inputs, its conditions, its consequences, its process steps, and its feedback. This particular definition is at a fairly high level, and I'll show you one that is more representative of how this is done. So we can not only do core processes and jobs, but we can do work groups as well. Here we have taken the defense in football and defined it. And we can also identify the business as a whole in football, that is known as the franchise. In business, it's known as the business unit, and we can define it the same way. This is a little job aid, which we commonly put in front of people, so that as we're doing any kind of needs assessment, analysis, definition of work, talking about work, this little the device becomes useful to them so that they can have a reference to doing the work as we're doing. So let me take you from that basic introduction to the elements of work to how we do that.
Danny, can I interrupt a minute?
Sure.
Just a couple of things for everybody to know. First of all, we have an electronic version of that, a YouTube that has it, has all of that, and that's in the resources. You'll be able to download it anytime. Secondly, we typically use that 10-minute teach, either the electronic version or you're getting to have the original from Danny, as the introduction, and then we go right into facilitating whatever work. So you may have a number of questions and we ask you to hold them, but we also don't let people ask very many questions. And the reason is that we want them to learn it by applying it. So it takes a facilitator to help them to apply it. And that's part of what I sometimes call our magic sauce. But we can touch on that later. I just wanted to make those 2 points and turn it back to Danny.
Thank you, Kathleen. One of the things that we discovered early on in the application of the language of work was that it wasn't enough just to do that 10-minute teach and expect people to be able to do things with it. Somehow to know automatically what those words mean and how they relate. For that, there are different kinds of, obviously, work requirements out there, and those different kinds of work requirements might need different tools to do the analysis through this work formula. And that led me about 2 years ago, 3 years ago maybe, to start looking at the various ways in which the formula could be displayed and used. And I ended up calling those work analytic tools because they are the means to operationalize the use of the formula in the language language work to meet various business goals and needs. So what I'm going to do is show you some of those tools. And to show you those, however, I want to do them in the context of where they're applied. And here's a listing of most of the WATs, as we call them now. There are work models. I'm going to show you a couple of those in particular. There are work matrices. I'm going to show you what those are, as is to-be tables. I'm going to show you dots on models, jobs identified to work models, and I think the other one is the work analysis aid. Those will be the primary WATs that we're going to look at. As we apply these WATs, we think of the various areas within which they can be used in terms of 3 work application models. We call them simply the business model, the managing model, and the working model. And the reason we do this, we need a context within which various audiences that perform work out there can think and act and do. So the business model is primarily for executives. It's not exclusively for them, but it is primarily under their domain. The managing model uses what we call the manager-worker interface, as does the working model use that same kind of orientation. And I'm going to show you each one of those models, and then I'll show you some of the work analytic tools within them. And I'm sorry we're doing this rather quickly, but all these things are detailed in some new books that we just published this last October, and you have a chance to look at those in detail. So the first one is the business model. And what this is, it's a very convenient way for an organization to define itself either currently, or if they wanted to reorganize, or if they wanted to start a new business, for example. And most organizations set about and define their mission, vision, and all those things you see on the right. And then there are the various stakeholders on the left who are charged with defining or reorganizing whatever else is this business. And here's the way that we suggest they go about doing it using the language work. What they want to define is how they're going to execute the work that will achieve those ends, whatever they might be. And there are 4 levels to work execution. The first of those is the business unit. And this is usually defined by executives. And what we do is we go in, define, give them a 10-minute teach. And within minutes, we have them defining what the business is. And it usually takes them no more than about a day, I would say. If they need a little more time, it might take a day and a half. But they can actually define their business in terms of what their outputs, inputs, and so on are. And I'll show you the form that takes in a couple of minutes. Then what you do is once that's done, you take the managers and you figure out the core processes. And that's the how. The executives are defining the what, the how is the core processes. This is the manufacturing, the sales, whatever the various what we call IMGs might be. This is where that's done, and they're normally done by managers, and a typical core process doesn't take any more than about a day or 2 to do. The third level to which we then go is to the job models. That's who's going to do the work, okay? And then we model those jobs using those 6 elements of work. And then we go to the teams to do the work groups, and that's how the work is going to be organized. I want you to note in here by example that when executives organize or reorganize, that's the step they normally start out at the organization, and it's really backwards. And this is quite a revelation to them when we point out that they really ought to be doing their business unit first the core process and so on. Okay, that's work execution. All work has to rise to certain kinds of standards. How do you set those standards? What are those standards? The language of work has a specific way of doing that, and I will show you that. All work needs support. This is what I generically call the culture. What are the various things that the organization is going to provide so people can do the work? You might think of the work execution as the fish swimming or people swimming, whereas the work support is the water that's necessary in order to do that. Then, of course, there are human relations factors, and there's a way language approaches that, as well as work financials. What are we doing here? We're trying to achieve alignment. And how's that alignment being achieved?
And
Well,
Denny, may I interrupt you? Just
Sure.
a moment. Lest anyone feel overwhelmed or feel like, oh my, you have to be awfully high in the organization to be able to use this tool. That's not the case at all. What you're getting here is the very, very big picture, but I'd like you to know that a lot of the work is done by performance technology people, learning people, starting at the work level, the job level. And what you're getting is, as a result of our practice over a couple of decades, we've been able to expand the application of those very simple, straightforward 6 words and apply them in different places. And with that, I turn the mic back to you, where Danny can show you how all of this ends up being providing alignment.
Okay. Here is a typical example of a work model. This is a work model for a core process. It happens to be, in this case, a SAP core process. And I wanted you to see it just to have you see one page of what this typically looks like when we are defining the work at a particular level. In this case, a core process. On the right-hand side, you see the output. There are several outputs, obviously, to this on different pages. On the left side, you see the inputs that are used to produce those outputs. They are cross-referenced to that output. You have a bunch of them on the left side, and in the lower left box is a continuation of those inputs. There's no order of magnitude or importance here. They're all simply listed. At the very bottom, you see the conditions. In the middle, you'll see the process steps, and you'll see that the reports produced requires 11 steps to get there. Those steps are many deliverables that one performs in order to produce those reports.
And again, coming in, this is usually facilitated with a group of 5 to 7 exemplary performers, and they are working together. They almost never are they able to say, oh yes, we do this, 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 and this in this order. Instead, they are pooling their knowledge of the output and coming to lay out the steps at a level that is high enough for everybody to understand, but not yet at a real level of granularity. That comes later. Back to you, Denny.
And the next thing we often do then is to simply list what kinds of jobs that are necessary in order to currently produce that work, or we could go to a to-be state where we could say what kind of jobs should be in place in order to perform this very process. So we simply list those, and then we color code them to which jobs do what steps in the process. And this gets us a direct link, a direct alignment between the core processes and the jobs necessary to do that. And then we can go from this stage to define the job models themselves. And those job models would have a similar look, as you see here, for a core process, in which we're defining what the outputs, inputs, and the various elements are of that work. Here is the page that typically has the consequences and feedback for any kind of work model. I mentioned work standards need to be set for all work. The language of work uses this kind of matrix in order to set those standards. They are tailored to business. This is simply a representative example of how we do that. Across the top are the 6 elements. Down the left side are the 4 levels: quality, generally desired in any kind of company, quantity, quality, timeliness, and cost. We do the same thing when it comes down to the work support itself, the culture, the stuff that's needed in order to assure that people have the right healthy environment in which to do their work. And what you see here is across the top are those 6 elements again. Down the left side, what you see are the 4 levels of work, and where any of those intersect are the various kind of interventions, the programs, the services, whatever that company wishes to provide are listed here. And now we can have a direct correlation between the work execution and the support that is necessary to make that happen. And the way that is often used, by the way, is through this kind of work analytic tool, where we collect statements from people about the work, what the organization could do to make their work better, as it were. These are often collected at the end of modeling sessions, or simply we can go out and do a general assessment to find these comments, and they are then, if you notice, comments are taken, put under the various elements that comprise the work support itself. And then out of that, we can identify specifically for management the areas of work support that need to be looked at and attended to, and due diligence played around in terms of how to make those things better in order to support people in doing their jobs. This has been turned out to be a highly effective tool, often used to do cultural due diligence.
And if I may come in on this as well, one of the big problems that organizations have is being able to analyze qualitative data. they're really good at the numbers, but when it gets to qualitative data, they have a lot of trouble. This, without going into any more detail, is an excellent way to do that because the work support matrix in front of you really defines the field of work support. There may be a few other things to add, but generally we've identified everything that a healthy organization ought to have in place. And by collecting the data and cross-referencing it to a fixed document, you can then show without having to just go to numbers, the qualitative feedback that you're getting from your employees.
Okay, and we can do the same thing for human relations. We can do it for financial support. So we're taking all of those different layers and levels of work, integrating them together for people in the company so that they can get a total picture of how to improve performance. Because as we all well know, a single intervention here now is important to improve, but really what you're trying to do is you're trying to get the whole boat to rise, as it were, and it often takes many different interventions to have that happen. I'd like to switch now from the business unit, the business model, over to the managing model for just a few minutes here, and then we'll get around to some questions that you can ask. We took a look at the various things that management does, and we put them into this particular diagram. And all this represents is on the left side, the kind of functions that a manager normally does. And those things they may do shared with the workers, and on the right side, those kind of things that workers do almost exclusively themselves, just to identify what they are. And then what we did was look at each one of them and say, okay, how are you going to implement that? How can you use this work formula to implement all of these different things? And what that resulted in is figuring out what work analytic tool, which you see on the right side here, is used to do each management function that you see in the middle. Otherwise, planning work uses work group and job models. If we get down to facilitating change, you'll see that the job models and work groups are also used there. And there are others where other kinds of WOTs can be used for those particular kind of functions, such that you can train managers up on the use of these various WOTs to use to the management function they are going to be using. So let me just show you a couple of those quickly. For example, if managers are to review performance with people, which has always been a strictly kind of thing to get done effectively, it works extremely well using the language of work, because what they do, they use the work formula in a very cause and effect kind of way. That is, the effect that they're trying to produce is the output and consequence. They can have a meaningful discussion with someone around what outputs have been achieved, what consequences have been achieved, and where they have not been achieved, what's the cause of that. And they, in that discussion, then look back at the process steps, the inputs, conditions, feedback, perhaps skills, knowledge, and attributes, and other support factors that actually would improve that performance. So this becomes a very dynamic discussion between parties to arrive at performing better. It can also be used to do as-is analysis, as-is to-be analysis, problem solving, as it were. This just happens to be a particular form that we use to capture that. And when we are doing it, what we're doing is we're taking the inputs, conditions, and process steps, and feedback, and figuring out what the various current stage and future stage should be. For example, this was an analysis of for engineers, as a matter of fact, Steve, where they were having to learn to make oral presentations to win new work in very large corporations. And one of the things we found out there, without getting into too much detail, was that this was being put together by the marketing manager, and it ought to have been put together by the project manager. So what we did is looked at that and said, what kind of change do we have to make here? Do we have to establish something and extinguish it? We developed a statement for it, figured out the kind of interventions that would work for it, and selected the best one to use, and did that for all the various changes that needed to be made. came up with an effective program that improved effective presentations by about 300% in terms of getting new work. Not a bad analysis, using as is in the language of work to do that. Here's another version of something a manager can do. This is an IT support services process. And what we have done here is simply do what we call dots on models, give people dots they can put and indicate where the problems are as they see it. And it starts to reveal a pattern of what areas need improvement. Here's an example of that was done back in Connecticut. Involved 22 different agencies. Those are all the core processes that are defined. They went up there and put all those little dots on it. They could then start talking about those areas as being problems and figuring out the solutions to it. And that was an extremely effective means. This is another work analytic tool that we suggest you use. This is what I'd like to think of as sort of Danny and Kathleen's brain on performance factors. These are the kinds of questions that we ask intuitively when we are analyzing any particular situation. The way this is organized is you see this is the work execution page. On the left there you see the outputs and consequences and the kind of questions that you ought to be asking. To its right are the conditions, the kind of questions to be asked, process steps. On the next page are the kind of questions to be asked for inputs, feedback, work standards, work support, human relations, and financial support. This is a simple job aid. Let's say you've done a model of something. You want to ask relevant questions to it. This is an aid you can turn to for those kinds of questions. Finally, we come to the working model. And again, I'll go through this rather quickly. It's pretty simple. Work implementation for individuals, that is for workers out there, is a matter of knowing what their job is and what they're to do on a team. And those are reflected in job models. So they use those models to implement, evaluate, and improve their own work. I want to take just a moment for this continuous improvement idea. This is a listing of the uses of it that you can make use of out of a job model, for example. Whose work will change, how will the work change, what are the skills and knowledge needed for that work, and so on. These job models turn out to be highly effective in making changes, let alone helping people do their work and be able to talk about their work with their management. But this business of continuous improvement has just absolutely intrigued me in the last few years. And one of the things that I came to figure out finally was that the language of work is really systems thinking. It's promoting a way to look at work and know how to change that work in a cause and effect kind of way. And we have found that as we started introducing this into companies and then they started using it over time, that they begin to think this way. And so they go into their meetings and they start talking about, well, what is the process steps here? What are the conditions we're trying to, and how can we change those kinds of things? So this mental picture that they have in their mind of how to look at work in a very systemic way and to look at it from a cause and effect way allows that continuous improvement, not to be a program so much, but as an individual way to look at, and a team way to look at how to make change. So this is finally a listing that I just wanted to show you that the language of work beyond those three models has uses in all kinds of other existing change programs that are being used, such as lean acquisitions and so on. And so what we have been recommending to people is they simply look at the language of work against these programs, or perhaps use the language of work in place of some of them. Finally, we just, as I mentioned before, completed this 3-book series, which is on these 3 models that I've described. And my goal here was to not just get our intellectual knowledge together, which I wanted to do since we're basically retired now, but I wanted to develop some sources that could be put directly in the hands of the people that we work with out there. So there's a book here for executives, there's a book here for managers, and there's a book here for workers. Because where I want to see us come to as professionals is we become work experts. We are the ones who want to go out and facilitate these various these various what's that can be used to analyze work and figure out where the needs are through those people. But to educate and better prepare those people to work with our expertise as facilitators of that, they need this kind of information. So this kind of information can be put directly in their hands. Okay. With that, large lecture on my part. Let's see what kind of questions you might
I hear an overwhelmedness. What? So we might want to start early in asking a couple of questions of you until you start asking us. But what questions might you have about the language of work as a formula? And I'm thinking partly the 6 words, but I'm also trying to see if you saw the ways in which it might have been useful to you in any of the work that you're doing now.
Kathleen, Tara added a comment about how impressed she is with the extensive comment you developed. And I guess my first question kind of starts before the language of work. I know the two of you have been in consulting for a long time, and you've worked with all sorts of organizations in different places doing different things. How often do you find situations where executives and managers have no idea how the work really gets done, and you find significant misalignment among the executive, manager, and worker levels of the organization?
I would say that it's nigh on to 98 or 99% of the time. When we're with people who are really very honest, managers in particular, they will just look with a certain amount of awe at the amount and kind of work that their employees are doing that they have no idea about. So that's an indicator to me, and it comes up in various ways. But what we really see is that everybody has a picture of the work and nobody has a complete picture of the work. And what this process does, by getting the group to agree first on the outputs at whatever level they are, whether it's the job, work group, the process, or the whole company, that's a very dynamic, interactive thing which a facilitator, a skilled facilitator handles. They are able to pool their various notions about the work and come to an agreement on one page that, on several one pages, if you know what I mean, without having to do wordsmithing and without having to fight to the death about this or that or the other thing. They build a picture that they all agree is the work, and that everybody, whatever level they're at, is able to leave, and we typically print it as well as send it to them electronically. They walk out of the room with a printout of the work that they did. And that's very powerful by itself, because they now have in their hand the thing they agreed to. What we have not had, I believe, any experience of is people saying, this is, I'm trying to think of this is crap. I think we can say crap. Nobody comes back and says, what is this? This is crap. They always go, oh my, this is really good. I never saw it that way, or I never understood it.
Let me add on to what Kathleen's saying there with a bit of philosophy that we've taken on. And that is, we recognize that people have the answers. They just don't know how to formulate the question. Now, if you're going to say they have the answers, then you have got to find a way for them to be able to achieve clarity in terms of the work itself. That's where this model comes in. Whenever you have them define a job or a core process or what have you, they are arriving at such clarity on this and consensus as to, yeah, this is what we do, that they are then able to look at it and say, this is where the problems are. And once they're able to then consistently look at where the problems are, they will say, oh, the solution to that is this, this, and that. What you have done through that kind of approach is you've gotten them to do the work. You've gotten them to do the analysis. You've gotten them to do the needs assessment and the solution. And they will commit to then that resolution. And that's a different role for us as professionals, because as professionals, we have most often been the ones who have to use some kind of methodology to figure out what the solution is going to be, the need and the solution, and then hoist that upon them or convince them that that's what it ought to be. This process takes us out of that and makes us more the expert on what work is, and then we are the facilitator working with those people for them to come up with the answers. Does that help?
I've got another question from Alicia. She thought the breakdown was really helpful and is wondering, how do you make this impactful when you don't have access to executives to do this work? How do you make them see the light?
Sure.
And I'd like to start, which is that it is pretty rare that even we come in at the executive level, where there usually is a need or a problem that we are approached to solve or work with. A big one in the early days of our consulting and developing this was around jobs, and jobs that were going to be impacted by the installation of enterprise-wide software such as SAP. And what happened is that we were, I think, people did nationwide searches on who could define jobs quickly and show high impact and change, and found us in the process. I'm not sure there are a lot of other people who have focused on that. And so what I would say to you is to take whatever problem either the organization provides you or you've identified, and go using this methodology, pursue that and show it. And what what we have then is a buildup of credibility. And if we go back to what Danny said, see yourself as an expert in work. And with that in your mind and where you're approaching whatever problem people are presenting to you, whether it's a learning problem or something else, then you are able to introduce this kind of thinking. It's rapid, it's effective, and they go, wow, that person really knows what they're doing, and build your career and then your access to executives through that. Danny, did you want to add to that?
I would say that right now you have some performance issues, problems out there. What I'm suggesting you do is try to analyze those in terms of the work formula and see what it does for you, what it does with those other people that you're working with. Beyond that, I know that, for example, we're working with the Boeing Corporation company right now, and what they've chosen to do, they called us over one time and wanted us to just work with 3 or 4 people, so we did. And out of that, decided they wanted to start certifying people in how to do job modeling. So they're certifying about 60 people to do that. And what they're doing, they're using that to figure out what the curriculum is going to be for all their workers. And it's a very simple, straightforward application of the language of work. And what will happen, I'm sure, out of that is that once that is done, and they're in the process of doing it, the people, managers will see how effective that is. And then they'll say, well, what else can you do for us? And that's where I say, where you step in with this book for managers to help them to figure out how to improve their performance. And they will then buy into that. And you need to have it grow from some point. And job models, far and away, is the easiest point from which you can grow the utilization of this kind of approach. You're not going to get that opportunity to completely reorganize a company, let's face it. But that ultimately, you want to get to that point, but you have to prove yourself up to there.
Devin's asked a question, and I'm going to ask it before mine. Is it possible to apply the working model as a tool directly at the team level without having to use the business or the managing models first? Or do you recommend working through the business model, then the management model, and then the working model as you drill down?
No, it's one of the problems I always run into when I introduce this business shoot or the business model, because it has all these various layers and levels to it. You can enter into any point of that model. It's okay. If you want to enter at the job level, enter there. If you wanted to do some kind of cultural assessment, you can enter there easily. You don't have to do the other things. These are independently operate as well as dependent. It's just if you were really wanted to organize a company completely, there is a preferred order in which that would be done. But start anywhere. It doesn't make any difference.
And I just want to say in answer to that, if you were to say, oh no, we can't solve that problem until we've done this, this, and this, the whole opportunity will disappear. So really and truly hear us when we say, think about the issues that are on your desk right now. What kinds of questions are you getting? What kinds of problems are people telling you about? And then think through, even with this brief introduction, but look at ways in which having a systematic approach and introducing the language of work would enhance the process for your client. Okay. And Steve, you wondered one?
Yeah, I have an additional question. One of the things that I think we've even spoken about at ISPI conferences is that there are really not a lot of performance improvement models that work systemically at the level of the organization. You know, the language of work is one. Gary Rumler has some models. Roger Addison's architecture of performance, you know, also, you know, is a little more systemic than others. Can you compare your language of work model to the family of cause analysis models that arise from Gilbert's BEM?
Let me start with that, and then Danny will come in. I would say that all of those models, to the degree that I've got familiarity with them, and it's some amount, not master's level, have all been attempts to define the organization and using models that made sense for the person who was creating it. And with Gilbert's, if you pardon me, I think there was so much complexity there that it was really hard for people to adapt or adopt, and then others created other models. Danny did something very different, and I'll leave it up to you to make some decisions about it. But he and the other people who were, you know, the Rumler and blah, blah, that crew, were all talking about performance improvement in ISPI in particular. And what Danny did was say, wait a second, we need to define performance. And we as an organization need to have adopted and agreed on what performance really is. And that caused a big maelstrom, actually, when Anne Morelli wrote an article to that and proposed that it be the language of work. So it's important, I think, for those of you who have worked with those various models to see that Danny was coming at it from a different perspective, and then measure those models against that. Do those models really capture performance in a behavioral and operational way? And I'll turn it back to Danny now.
There's so much to be said about that. I mean, I know all these people, worked with them. We used to have a discussion group, 7 of us who would get together, you know, Toasty and Cromler and Kaufman and all those kind of people. And we used to go through these things just right and left with one another. I think from my perspective, Kathleen is capturing the difference there. I've tried to look at there's the systemic nature of the formula first, okay? And then there is the systemic nature of an organization. And that's why I have these kind of models, particularly the business model. It's an attempt to say, look, this is what makes up the work of an organization. It has various levels to it, and I identified 4 of those. And there are certain layers to it, and I've identified 4 of those: work standards, and work support, and so on. And they all have a systemic relationship to them. This is a dynamic organism out there when you think of a whole. And so you have to have an effective way to represent that so that everybody can look at it and in the same way and be thinking, and acting, and talking, and designing, and identifying in the same basic kind of way. So we have to educate people as to what that dynamic system is. At the same time, they have to be able to understand in terms of what they can do with it individually themselves. And that requires the definition of their job. So that is always a nice beginning point to define a job model for anybody. So sometimes when I want to convince an organization to do something, I say, why don't we just define your job right here now? It's only going to take us 4 hours. If you want to, I'll define this job for you, and we'll sit down and we'll do it. And at the end of it, they always say, my God, that's the first time I really ever understood what this is about. Okay? That's a beginning point. And then you can show them what they can do with that model in terms of evaluating their own performance, figuring out where the needs of the problem or a change is coming along. Where's it going to impact that change? What am I going to do about it? So that kind of addressing into any organization, whether you're internal or external, is a good starting point. Because I also recognize that a single solution to any particular problem, while it is useful, it is not the answer in the long run, because there are many others that relate to it systemically that need to be addressed as well. And so having a model which does that is best represented, in my very humble opinion, by the language of work, because it is the most robust way of looking systemically at what's going on in an organization.
And we have one more question from Alicia and a stop in about a couple of minutes. And so this is the challenge round where the time decreases and the question is good and complex. So Alicia notes, I'm an L&D manager. I'm new to the job and I noticed that we work hard but not smart. I was also given the task of creating level 1 and level 3 evaluations. But after reviewing the training, there aren't any clear objectives. The direct clients would be HR and the indirect clients are the employees receiving the training, but I'm not sure how I should respond to this situation.
That's probably a good hour of visiting, which we may, if we weren't leaving the country on Saturday, I would set up a date to do that. But I think that you have it right there. If there are no clear objectives, it's pretty hard to evaluate the training at all, except, you know, the smile test. Do they like it? But you may want to just have a chat with HR and say, what is it that you want employees to do after they have this training? And I don't know how complex it all is. And be looking for the outputs in terms of what they can do. Can they answer the phone? Can they greet? Can they whatever? And then using that backing in, I think, is what I'm really talking about. A lot of times what we do is make explicit what is implicit. And if there's an implicit understanding of what the training is doing, then make it explicit and then build the evaluations around that. That would be my quick answer. Hopefully not dirty answer to that.
And with that, we've come to the end of the hour. I'd like everyone to join me in thanking Danny and Kathleen for sharing your expertise with us and sharing your language of work. Thank you so much.
And Steve, is it true that we can continue to answer questions without
If
recording?
you want, we can stay until people are done posing questions.
We have another 20, 25 minutes that we can do.
And then one other thing I might add, we are extremely receptive to emails and answering questions. I'm just a big believer in that kind of thing. I'm not going to try to sell you something or anything. I'm past that. I'm done with it. Done my thing up there in the world, but I still love to answer questions for people. So you can always email me. Okay. Any questions?
I can jump in here if people want to take the time to type something in the chat. Can you share anything about one of your current language of work projects in terms of who's the client? What are you helping them do? Have you started obtaining any interesting results?
You want to handle that, Kathleen? Why don't you describe what's going on with the Boeing and how, generically, what they're attempting to do?
Right. Our biggest focus right now, really, because we are not marketing, so we don't have a lot in the way of new clients coming in, which is okay by us, is that one of your graduates, Chester, who now goes by Chet Stevenson, went to work for the Boeing Corporation, and he had some professional development dollars and asked if we, who live up the street from him, 50 miles or so, could do an intensive on the language of work for him and a couple of his colleagues. And we did, and we certified them. And as a result, his manager, who has gone up in the organization since then, has insisted that everyone in his organization take a 5-day course in the language of work. Now, what happens is that on the first day, they get the 10-minute teach, and we model a job for them. And I do the facilitation, and Danny does the data entry, and we have content experts there who actually are modeling a real job. Excuse me. After that, the next 3 days, they do parts of the modeling, so they have some experience with it. And the last day, Danny does a presentation, very similar to what you have done. Subsequent to that, they can ask to be certified, and in their certification, they do a live job and get feedback from someone we've certified who sends us the data, and we give it to them. So the real work that we've been doing most recently really is training people in the methodology as opposed to actually working on a project. However, what they've been able to do is to respond to issues that have included how do we build a Boeing University in business development. And they modeled all of the jobs in that sector, and then defined the skills and knowledge, which actually Danny didn't touch on. This the job modeling includes a definition of skills and knowledge by process, really. And with that list, they then were able to go back and get novice, intermediate, and expert definitions of the ability to do those and what skills were needed. And from that to define the coursework that would be needed. So we got them started, and I believe that we modeled the jobs for them. It was a couple of years ago, and they weren't ready to do that work themselves. But they took the job models that we produced and built a whole curriculum. Now, the sad part is there's a change of direction and it has not been implemented. But other than that, they had the plan. They were able to build the plan in a relatively short period of time. Mm-hmm.
Are there any other questions?
People are saying thank you. We like that.
Yeah, people are saying thank you. Right. Sounds like you're screening through the chat stream too.
I am. I thought there was one other question. Tara, is Tara still on?
Yes, I'm still here.
Okay, I didn't really understand your question.
I know, I'm finding a lot of times that I'm not interpreting stuff right, so you'll have to bear with me. But I guess I'm just trying to find out that, okay, I'm trying to compare you to certain other models, and I'm brand new, so bear with me. Like I said, I'm not sure I've noticed some other things I'm not really interpreting well either, or not using the right terminology as you talk about.
Don't worry about it, just tell me what you need.
So I'm really trying to find out, in comparison to that, it almost seemed like you were saying that you kind of added more of everybody determining what the behavior is that you're trying to get to. So in that type of way, you've added kind of assessing some of the behavioral components as performance assessment, or am I not understanding that?
How about if I respond to what I think you're saying?
Okay.
And please know that I also am I'm a great communicator, except people don't get it, what I'm asking, okay? So let's do it at the job level. We'll just focus on the job. And at the job level, what we are asking for is, for their outputs, it is deliverables, which is tangible things that they produce. Now, okay?
Yeah, okay.
So then you can assess it. It's good, it's bad, it's whatever. But this is part of understanding Danny's world, which is that he defines, and I agree, that work is the same as performance is the same as behavior.
Okay.
So that's why, yes, you can assess it. You don't have to add a behavioral component. If producing reports is my deliverable, right? Then that's a behavior and we can measure it. And just as an aside, I don't know if it's clear from whatever, but I was in an HR department for about 10 years and brought that, many of their needs into the work and the models that we developed. And as an exercise in that, I read a ton of job descriptions. And what I found was pretty universally, they were 40%, the first 40% was do these things. It was product, able to, I don't know, assess performance, do whatever,
Right.
40% of doing. And then it went into a wish list of would work well with others and is detail minded and, you know, collection of wishes for the way that person was. We separate that out by and our job models can be used to create job descriptions. And the job description is a combination of the output with the consequences. Then separate from that, we derive the skills, the knowledge, and the attributes, the detail-minded, etc., into that package, and keep the two separate, which I think is much fairer to employees and also allows managers to be able to focus on, is this something I can send this person to training for? Or is this an attribute that no amount of training is going to make them able to do?
Excellent. Okay, thanks.
Okay.
I'm going to give you just some criteria that you might think about relative to looking at these different models. You have to ask yourself whether, first of all, the model is a reflection of what that organization, any organization, looks like. Okay? Then there's the behavioral part of it. The reason I said that is because it lets you look at Hoffman's stuff, and he talks about these different levels and so on. Is that a reflection of what an organization is like, or a society, or whatever else? This formula idea and this word model is extremely important, because the formula has to have all the elements in it that actually make for what worker performance is. So, for example, if you were to look at CPOC, people often say, well, CPOC is this. But if you look at it, it actually has 3 of the 6 elements in their work, at least as I define it. And then it has 2 others, which are about the supplier, which has nothing to do with performance other than it's an input. And then it has customer, I think, on the end, which has the end that you're trying to achieve, but it's only half of what a formula would be. It would be like saying water is H2. The water is not H2, it's H2O. So if you're going to look at Rummler or anybody else, you want to look at it and say, is this a complete picture, model of what that work is? Because if it's not, you end up only defining part of it. And that's true of an objective. If you define only objectives for something, you're only defining part of the performance. You're only modeling part of it. That's true of a competency. It's true of any number of attempts at trying to figure out what that behavior is out there that we're trying to help achieve. Objectives fail because they're only part of what the behavior is. Whereas I think, until somebody else proves me wrong, that the 6-element formula is a depiction of the basic elements that make up work, and systemically how they interact with one another in order to produce the desired behavior. And when they are missing, they tell you where the problem is. Okay? So look at these different models, in a sense, from their completeness. Any other questions?
Thank you, guys. That's helped a lot. Like, I am noticing that I'm kind of needing a lot of that reiteration. So thank you.
You're welcome. It's a complicated field out there. There's just no question about that. I think I'm a very strong believer that things need to change in our own profession to become better at what we do. And that's why I'm trying to get people to concentrate on work, because that's what employees think of it as. They don't think of it as performance. If you ask them what performance is, you're going to get all kinds of stuff. But if you ask them what work is, oh, work is what I do. Okay, here's how you can define what you do. Oh, okay, that makes sense. Now you want to change it? Oh, well, I don't think I need to look back here. The inputs that I'm getting, they're coming in late to me, so that's what's affecting me. and I can go tell my manager that because he thinks the same way I do about that work. That's the fundamental, down to the earth point at which work really makes a lot of difference in its definition and how we're going to talk about stuff and look at it. And I'm trying to get people to look at it the same way, because once they do, it is extremely powerful. Once clarity comes about, they know exactly what they'll say to you. That reflects my job. And that's the first time anybody's ever defined for me the model of my work. And now I can go talk to my manager about, or my team person about it, because they're looking at it the same way. So that's my...
And we get that a lot, and we get it at really rudimentary levels in an organization, in a factory that made paint or something, all the way up to people who have been colonels or even generals in the Army or the Air Force and said, this is terrific. So we feel like we have done the R&D and done the proof of concept, and we really hope that people younger than we are, which is not hard to do, to be, will pick up the standard and go forward. And it has the potential for really improving everybody's existence in the work world. And so that's what we think about it, and want you to share that enthusiasm. And with that, I think I will leave you. If anybody has anything else, they can keep on talking to Danny, but I have people to see and things to do. But I had a great time, and I've got a note to everybody for that.
Hi, Kathleen.
Okay.
And thanks again, Kathleen.
You're welcome, Steve. Great working with you.
As always, great working with both of you too.
Thanks, Dave.
Are there any other questions for Danny while we have him?
Okay, send me an email.
All right, sounds good. I'd like to thank everyone for participating. And again, Danny and Kathleen, thank you. And everybody, OPWL rocks. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.